So a catalog ranking video is not, of course, a particularly original concept, and I'm sure a few people have done Camel before, but this one is coming from a particular perspective, which is that after about a decade of slow realization, I've come to the conclusion that actually every Camel album is great, and I want to make the case for why I think that is. Now, to some of you, that may seem self evident, but to me, as someone who really didn't hear any Camel at all until about 2010, and for a lot of the friends and peers I had that were approaching them at the same time, it initially seems like there is a huge drop off in quality after the first four albums, right? After the classic lineup starts to dissolve and the personnel shifts begin to come in. And that initial run, those first four albums with that classic lineup, are the kind of thing that I think anybody who's interested enough in that kind of music to hear them will immediately recognize them as classic. They have that where have you been all my life kind of quality. The mid to late stuff doesn't so much. Now, 2010, that was a period in my life where I was very broke and I had a huge appetite for music. And it was also the height of the file sharing Pirate Bay kind of era, right? So I did what a lot of people did in that time and just torrented the whole catalog. And obviously, from an ethical and aesthetic standpoint, that's not the best way to approach it, but nothing to be done about that now. And if you get the whole catalog for free and gobble it up in one big kind of undifferentiated mass, the first four albums are obvious in their brilliance, but everything after that can seem cloying or undercooked or dated or unserious or bland. So there were maybe 5 or 6 years where I thought that the early stuff was some of the best music I'd ever heard, the mid to late stuff really not even worth paying attention to. What changed it for me actually was an experience in 2016 where I had my wisdom teeth out. And after that surgery, I spent a few days in sort of an opiated, bedridden haze. And I didn't have the mental bandwidth to really do much besides immerse myself in music. And the drugs softened a lot of the judgments I had been applying. And suddenly, I recognized all the great aspects to those albums that I'd never heard before. So the goal of this video is an extended argument for the qualities that it took me, at least, so long to hear, and that other people who are coming to the catalog fresh might be overlooking. And, putting these into a ranked list was a way of helping myself think through what it is that's successful or effective about each of these albums, as well as, in a few limited cases, what's maybe not so much. So if you're new to Camel, I hope that this encourages you to delve carefully into everything they've done, even things that might seem underwhelming on a first listen. If you're a long-time Camel fan, I hope some of what I say resonates here, maybe encourages you to come back to something you might have dismissed. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project with a Camel-esque mission of balancing emotion and melody with complex writing and conceptual ambition. Check us out on Bandcamp or your preferred streaming platform. If you have any agreements or disagreements with my thoughts here, let me know in the comments. And if you can find it in yourselves to like and subscribe, the encouragement always helps. So I'm going to immediately contradict the premise of my video by admitting that it would be an overstatement maybe to say that this album is great. But I do contend that it is underrated. Now, it's more of a pop album than anything else in the catalog, which isn't automatically bad, but in this case, they're not really handling that style in a compelling way. The songs don't really achieve memorable hooks. Andrew Latimer's vocal style isn't that well suited to this type of music. The songs often have kind of a plodding, draggy quality that doesn't really fit this sound. So they're deliberately avoiding music that is rewarding to the head, but at the same time, their skill set maybe isn't that effective in creating something with a more emotional or gut level appeal. Now, the instrumental pieces here, Salvia and Sasquatch, are both quite beautifully composed and played, and I think could be pretty smoothly slotted into better other Camel albums. But otherwise, what's effective here tends to be elements within songs, not the overall song. So that does take some consistent attention to sort out. So for instance, if you listen to No Easy Answer on the headphones, then you'll notice that there are two keyboard tracks that one's in the left channel, one's in the right channel. They play off each other in interesting ways where they kind of work in opposition and then occasionally come together in unison. That's a really interesting detail in the arrangement. The intro to the song Heroes has some great kind of moody synthesizer layering, which feels more classically Camel. It has some evocative fretless bass, has a really impressive bit of overdubbed vocal overplay in the section just right in the moment before the drums come in. The main section of the song Manic has kind of a galloping bass rhythm that is matched with a big dramatic chord sequence in a way that's always reminded me a bit of Iron Maiden, though, I don't want to oversell that comparison. So, ultimately, I'd say every song here has at least one compelling or creative bit of musical detail that is enriching what otherwise might be a pretty underwhelming listen. And nothing here is notably embarrassing or particularly annoying, There's no equivalent to something like Who Done It by Genesis or Leave It by Yes. And I think that lack of any really off-putting misstep is symptomatic of both the strengths and flaws of this album and kind of maybe even Latimer's work on a larger scale, right? He's not enough of a risk taker to really fuck up, but the album can't really succeed at a total reinvention for that same reason. So ultimately, I know I'm not the only one to rank this particular one low, usually regarded as their worst album, and I can't really argue with that, but I do think that it's more rewarding than you might expect of a really attentive listen, and it is interesting to dig into it and find some of the really smart playing and arrangement that's still there, even when they're not at their best. So number 13, I'm putting Harbour of Tears, which is pretty much tied with Dust and Dreams, since they're both historically oriented concept albums that are focused on periods characterized by hardworking people struggling against poverty. And when I first listened to this and Dust and Dreams, I was fairly bothered by the mismatch between the ambition of what Latimer's trying to do here and the resources that were available to actually carry that ambition out, right? The arrangements here are very based on synthesizer strings and pads. Even though there is some live instrumentation, the synthesized parts kind of dominate the overall impression. And the drums, where they do appear, are either programmed or they're played in a very sparing way and mixed so that they sound programmed. And in places, those qualities have the effect of making this feel more like a demo than a full album. And it doesn't really have the level of detail in the playing and arranging that most other Camel does. But having spent the last several years making conceptual rock on my own with synthesizers and pads and programmed drums, I'm now much more sympathetic to all that stuff, right? And I'm much more appreciative of the effort and ambition that were involved in making an ambitious conceptual work when you don't have a label in your corner. And Latimer even did it, in this case, before crowdfunding and VST, right? So that's even more of a triumph. So this album's home-built nature has gone from being something that bothered me about it to actually something that I really admire. It also has kind of a bleak, austere sound to it that I found off-putting when I first encountered it, but again, makes sense to me now because it's trying to capture the mood of, people who are really living bleak, austere lives. So it's thematically appropriate that this is relatively low-key compared to most of their other works, and Latimer's more subdued vocal style here also serves to carry that across. Now, all these perspectives, I guess, might make it sound like I'm portraying this as an album that is admirable more than it is enjoyable, and I can't really dispute that. This isn't one of the first things that I'd go to if I want to listen to Camel, but it has a purity of spirit and intention that I've really come to respect. So in terms of concept and style, this is very similar to Dust and Dreams. Like that album, it's built around electric piano and layers of synthesizers, and the analog instruments that do appear here tend to get a little bit overwhelmed and washed out in the final arrangement by the more synthesized sounds. And the lyrical concept, of course, of poor migrants during the Depression is very similar to the lyrical concept in Harbour of Tears of poor Irish people immigrating for work. But I think that the sonic palette here actually works really well relative to the concept. I don't mean this I don't mean this word in a bad way, even though it's probably going to sound critical, but the drabness of the big washes of synth and kind of the plain stoic drums have an effect which actually summons the spirit of that era really well. And it makes a kind of emotional sense, even though it doesn't, strictly speaking, sound like music from that time. Structurally, there are a couple of things in the middle which feel like landmark pieces and which really stand out. The repeated interlocking vocal lines in the song Rose of Sharon are haunting and memorable and very sad if you know the story of the novel. And then the kind of quiet, angry dignity of the song End of the Line sits really at the narrative and emotional core of the album. And I'll admit here that the pacing does somewhat confuse me, right? That song, End of the Line, feels like a climactic point, but it comes halfway through the album, and the instrumentals, which then comprise the second half, almost feel like more sort of an extended epilogue. But in spite of that nitpick about pacing and sequence, I'm still putting this one a bit ahead of Harbour of Tears just because the vocal pieces in the first half go to a little bit greater extremes of emotion, and I do find them a bit more affecting. And, all the things that I said a minute ago about the admirable qualities of Harbour of Tears apply here as well, maybe even more so since this was the first time he had done it. So this is the point in the catalog where a lot of serious prog fans tend to drop off. And I don't really know if anybody listens to Camel other than serious prog fans, so maybe that just means this is the point where a lot of listeners drop off. And I'll fully grant you that this is a messy, inconsistent album, right? And that if you listen to it right after Mirage, it could seem like a bit of a shocking come down. The trick here is that as much as any other Camel album, here you have really excellent playing and arrangement living in songs which on a surface level might seem a bit underwhelming or off-putting. So for instance, the title track is kind of an underwhelming pop ballad, but Richard Sinclair throws in some wonderful bass fills, and the interweaving of the various woodwind lines on the fade out is a really great detail that I missed during maybe my first dozen times listening to this album. Or the song Starlight Ride is a little bit slight from a writing perspective, but the quick electric piano runs at the beginning are great, a really fascinating playing detail. And there's a wonderfully elegant kind of medievalish clean guitar section in the middle, which is interwoven with the woodwinds in a very complex way. And as far as the weirder tracks, I'll certainly concede the point that Down on the Farm doesn't really make sense in the sequencing, but it's charming enough as an oddity, I think. And then the second half of this album has a couple of songs in a row which sound almost like kind of a hybrid of progressive rock and disco, oddly enough. And I can't necessarily mount an intellectual defense of those songs, but they feel to me quite transporting. They feel like sitting outside watching the stars on sort of a warm, damp summer night. So ultimately, this one is a bit of a dog's breakfast, right? But the individual bits do tend to range from pretty awesome down to maybe a mess song with some very impressive elements in it, right? And like most of their middle period, I think it's easy to miss here how much really impressive stuff there is to be gathered with a couple of attentive listens, particularly if you go into it with the assumption that there is good stuff here to find. All right, so it's turned out that I actually have a lot more to say about these Camel albums than I expected. So I'm actually, I think, going to split this up into a 3-part video. Looks like each of these is it's going to be about 20 minutes per. So we'll leave off at number 11. Thanks much for your time and attention thus far, and I'll see everybody in a couple weeks when we continue going through the many, many virtues of the Camel catalog.